The ship moving through the Bosphorus did not look like a normal oil tanker anymore. It was old, heavily sanctioned, and surrounded by improvised structures that seemed more appropriate for a battlefield than a commercial shipping lane. Nets and metal barriers covered vulnerable areas. Additional protection had been fitted around parts of the vessel. From a distance, the tanker looked less like a merchant ship and more like something assembled for a post-apocalyptic film. That is why the description Mad Max at Sea has spread so quickly. The vessel was the Caruzo, a 28-year-old tanker associated with Russia's so-called Shadow Fleet. Another tanker, the Rizval, was later observed with similar modifications in the Sea of Marmara. Financial Times reporting says Russian-linked tankers and port facilities are being equipped with anti-drone nets, cages, and other improvised barriers as Moscow searches for ways to defend maritime traffic from Ukraine's expanding drone campaign. The appearance is extraordinary, but the reason behind it is more important than the appearance itself. Russia is being forced to militarize the ships that carry its oil, fuel, and supplies. Tankers that once depended on paperwork, obscure ownership, changing flags, and the enormous size of the sea for protection are now relying on visible physical defenses. The Shadow Fleet used to hide behind legal and commercial complexity. Now parts of it are trying to hide behind steel. That is a strategic victory for Ukraine even before the effectiveness of those defenses is tested. But we need to begin with what is known and what remains uncertain. Photographs and reporting indicate that some Russian-linked vessels have received unusual anti-drone modifications. They do not show that every tanker has been altered. They do not prove that the defenses will succeed or fail in a real attack. And they do not mean Ukraine can strike any vessel, anywhere, without military, political, environmental, or legal consequences. The exact number of tankers protected in this way is unclear. The precise ownership and operational control of many Shadow Fleet vessels is deliberately difficult to establish. That opacity is part of the system. Yet the existence of the modifications is significant because states and shipping operators do not cover commercial vessels with anti-drone netting unless they believe the threat is real. The defenses are therefore evidence of fear, adaptation, and cost. To understand why, we first have to understand what the Shadow Fleet actually is. It is not one officially registered Russian shipping company with a single headquarters, flag, and command structure. It is a loose and often opaque network of tankers, management firms, intermediaries, shell companies, flag registries, traders, insurers, and service providers. Many of the vessels are older. Ownership can change. Names and flags can change. Tracking systems may be switched off or manipulated. Ship-to-ship transfers can make the origin and destination of a cargo harder to follow. The European Union describes the Shadow Fleet as a network used to carry Russian oil and oil products while circumventing sanctions and the oil price cap. By July 2026, the EU had placed more than 670 vessels on its Shadow Fleet sanctions list. Not every suspicious ship is sanctioned by every country, and not every Russian-linked tanker performs the same mission. That distinction matters. The label is widely used, but the evidence for individual vessels must still be examined case by case. The strategic purpose of the network is easier to see. Russia needs to sell oil. Oil exports generate revenue, sustain state finances, and help support the war economy. Russia also needs ships to move fuel and supplies through the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov, including routes connected to occupied Crimea and Russian forces in southern Ukraine. Sanctions were designed to make that trade more difficult and more expensive. The Shadow Fleet developed to keep it moving. For years, the main contest was financial and regulatory. Western governments sanctioned vessels, owners, traders, and service providers. Ships changed flags and management. European states increased inspections and restrictions. Insurers examined exposure. Russia and its commercial partners built new layers of legal separation. Ukraine has added a different kind of pressure. It has turned the Shadow Fleet from a sanctions problem into a physical security problem. In July, Ukrainian forces said they attacked multiple tankers in the Sea of Azov that were supplying fuel to Russian-occupied Crimea. Reuters reported that Ukraine claimed 12 tankers had been struck over 2 days. Reuters could not independently verify the full Ukrainian account, and found that only 2 of 7 initially identified vessels were under international sanctions. That does not erase the attacks. It demonstrates why precise language is essential. Some vessels may support Russian military logistics without appearing on every sanctions list. Others may be described too broadly in wartime statements. The larger campaign is still unmistakable. Ukrainian drone units have expanded attacks from fixed infrastructure on land to vessels, cranes, ferries, port facilities, and maritime supply routes. Reuters reporters visiting a Ukrainian drone unit in July described crews launching attack drones from southern Ukraine as part of a widening campaign around Crimea. Ukrainian commanders claimed they had hit more than 180 vessels and other maritime targets in several weeks, though Reuters said many of those claims could not be independently confirmed. Even if the announced totals are treated cautiously, Russia's response provides its own form of confirmation. Shipping has been interrupted. Ports have paused operations during attacks. Tankers have moved away from threatened terminals. Additional barriers have appeared around ports. And now commercial vessels are sailing with improvised anti-drone protection. The defender is changing behavior. That is one of the clearest measures of strategic effect. A successful military campaign does not always require the destruction of every target. Sometimes its purpose is to make the opponent operate differently. Ships sail less frequently. Routes become longer. Cargoes wait. Crews demand more protection. Ports close temporarily during alerts. Tankers disperse into open water. Defenses add weight, maintenance, and complexity. Insurers recalculate risk. Owners demand higher compensation. The cargo may still arrive, but the system becomes slower, more expensive, and less predictable. This is particularly important at sea because maritime trade depends on routine. A tanker makes money when it is moving cargo between predictable loading and discharge windows. A port makes money when vessels arrive, load, and depart on schedule. Pipelines continue feeding storage tanks because another ship is expected to remove the product. Pilots, tugs, crews, inspectors, and terminal workers are organized around that sequence. Interrupt one vessel, and the effect may be limited. Interrupt the schedule repeatedly, and pressure begins to move through the entire network. The temporary shutdown at Novorossiysk in August illustrated this point. After a drone attack, Russia's principal Black Sea oil port briefly halted crude loadings. Reuters reported that the terminal stopped accepting oil when storage tanks reached capacity. Operations later resumed, and tankers returned to loading. This was not a permanent blockade. It was not proof that Russia's exports had been stopped. But it showed how an attack lasting hours can create a chain of operational decisions across ships, storage, pipelines, and commercial schedules. That is the environment in which the Mad Max defenses have appeared. At first glance, it may seem absurd that a vessel hundreds of times larger than a drone would need protection from it. Size, however, is not the same as invulnerability. A tanker is a giant industrial system designed for efficient transport, not for combat. It has engines, steering equipment, electrical systems, communications, navigation equipment, cargo handling machinery, pumps, crew spaces, and exposed working areas. Many of these components are difficult to duplicate at sea. Damage does not have to sink the ship to remove it from commercial service. A fire, disabled system, breached compartment, or requirement for inspection can be enough to force a diversion and repair. This is one of the central lessons of drone warfare. The attacker does not always need to destroy the entire platform. It needs to damage something that the platform cannot operate safely without. Ukraine learned this principle first against Russian warships. Sea drones did not have to defeat the Black Sea Fleet in a traditional surface battle. They created a persistent threat that forced Russian ships to remain farther from Ukrainian-controlled waters, use barriers and patrols, and move important assets from Sevastopol toward Novorossiysk. Air and sea drones, missiles, intelligence, and repeated attacks worked together to reduce the freedom of movement of a much larger navy. Now that logic is being applied to maritime logistics. A tanker does not possess the layered defenses of a modern warship. It may have civilian radar and cameras, but it was not designed to track multiple small threats approaching close to the surface or from the air. Its crew is trained to navigate, manage cargo, control machinery, and respond to emergencies. It is not a naval combat team with an integrated air defense system. Russia can place armed personnel aboard, add observation posts, or arrange protection from aircraft and patrol boats. It can surround parts of a vessel with netting and barriers. It can strengthen port security and increase surveillance. But every step changes the economics and risk profile of what is supposed to be commercial transport. The nets and cages are intended to create distance between an incoming drone and a vulnerable part of the ship, obstruct the drone's path, or cause it to detonate before reaching its intended point. Similar concepts have appeared on armored vehicles and around fixed installations. At sea, however, the environment is different. Wind, saltwater, waves, limited deck space, loading operations, firefighting access, visibility, and emergency escape all complicate the design. A structure that offers protection during transit could interfere with work in port. A barrier that blocks one approach may create blind spots elsewhere. Additional equipment requires inspection and maintenance. Improvised defenses may have to be removed or repositioned before cargo operations. They can also affect how the crew moves during an emergency. This does not mean the defenses are useless. Even a simple obstacle can make an attack more difficult. It can force an incoming weapon to hit at a less effective angle, cause premature detonation, or buy the crew time to react. Security experts quoted in maritime reporting have said such measures can make a real difference. But can make a difference is not the same as makes the ship safe. No passive barrier offers complete protection against a threat that can change over time. Ukraine has used different combinations of aerial drones, uncrewed surface vessels, and missiles in the maritime theater. Defenders respond to the last successful method. Attackers observe the response and search for a new weakness. This cycle creates an arms race in which both sides constantly adjust. The improvised appearance of the tankers tells us that Russia needs protection faster than it can develop an elegant, standardized solution. That speed matters. A naval architecture program takes time. Purpose-built defensive systems require design, testing, training, integration, and production. The Shadow Fleet includes vessels of different ages, sizes, configurations, flags, and ownership structures. There is no single package that can be fitted to every ship without modification, so the immediate response is practical. Use nets, cages, barriers, extra surveillance, armed security, and port defenses. The result may look crude, but crude systems can still be useful. Russia has repeatedly shown that it is willing to accept unattractive and inefficient solutions if they keep equipment operating. The key question is not whether the defenses look ridiculous. It is how much pressure was required to make them necessary. Every tanker altered in this way represents a new expense. Materials have to be purchased. Shipyards or crews have to install them. Safety procedures may need revision. Ports must accommodate the modifications. Captains and operators must decide when the barriers remain in place and when they are moved. The protection has to survive long voyages and harsh weather without creating new hazards. Scale multiplies the problem. Russia does not depend on one tanker. A shadow fleet works because many vessels distribute risk across different routes, owners, flags, and ports. Protecting one high-value ship is possible. Protecting hundreds of old tankers, support vessels, ferries, tugs, terminals, anchorages, and loading points is a very different task. This creates the same defensive dilemma Ukraine has imposed on Russian industry ashore. If Moscow concentrates protection around a few major ports and vessels, traffic outside those zones becomes more exposed. If it spreads patrol boats, aircraft, electronic warfare, and surveillance across a huge maritime area, each location receives less protection. If tankers form convoys, they become easier to escort but harder to schedule and potentially easier to locate. If they travel independently, the defender must monitor a larger number of routes. The Black Sea and Sea of Azov are not empty spaces. They contain commercial lanes, fishing vessels, ports, coastal settlements, neutral shipping, and routes essential to more than one country. Russia's Novorossiysk system also carries oil from landlocked Kazakhstan. That creates political complications for Ukraine, the United States, Turkey, European states, shipping companies, and energy markets. The military target and the commercial network overlap. That overlap is one reason the campaign is risky. A successful strike on a tanker can interrupt Russian logistics or revenue. It can also endanger civilian crews, create an oil spill, damage neutral property, or raise shipping costs across the region. An error in identification can cause a diplomatic crisis. An attack near another country's waters can provoke condemnation even when the vessel is sanctioned. Turkey has repeatedly emphasized the safety of navigation in the Black Sea. Western governments want to reduce Russia's war revenue, but they also want to avoid uncontrolled disruption to global energy supplies. Ukraine wants to pressure Russian shipping while protecting its own grain corridor and access to the sea. Russia strikes Ukrainian ports and has threatened retaliation for actions against its shipping. Every side, therefore, operates inside a narrow space between pressure and escalation. This is why Ukraine's reported proposal for a Black Sea truce over civilian vessels matters. Kyiv can distinguish, at least politically, between military targets, ships directly supporting Russian operations, sanctioned oil carriers, and genuinely civilian shipping. In practice, those categories can become difficult to separate when ownership is opaque and vessels carry dual-purpose cargo. The Mad Max modifications reveal that Russia does not trust legal ambiguity alone to protect the ships. Before the drone campaign expanded, a tanker could reduce exposure through paperwork and geography. It could change its name, flag, manager, or registered owner. It could turn off its automatic identification system. It could transfer cargo at sea. It could use a complicated chain of intermediaries that made sanctions enforcement slow. None of those methods can stop an approaching drone. The physical world has caught up with the paperwork. That is the deeper transformation. Sanctions target the legal and financial identity of a vessel. Drones target the vessel itself. A company can be dissolved and replaced. A flag can be changed. A cargo can be relabeled. But a steel hull has one position in the water, and it must eventually approach a port, pass through a strait, or enter a loading area. The closer the tanker comes to the infrastructure that makes it useful, the more predictable its movement becomes. Russia's answer will extend beyond netting. We should expect more surveillance around ports, greater use of patrol craft, armed teams aboard selected ships, electronic warfare, decoys, helicopters or aircraft on alert, and additional barriers at harbor entrances. Shipping schedules may become less public. Ships may wait farther offshore. Routes and loading procedures may change. Russia may also retaliate more aggressively against Ukrainian ports and merchant shipping. These adaptations can reduce Ukraine's success rate. The Russian military and commercial system is not passive. It studies attacks, repairs damage, and develops countermeasures. Ukraine's drone units will lose vehicles. Some operations will fail. Weather and electronic warfare will disrupt missions. Ports will reopen after attacks, as Novorossiysk did. But adaptation does not erase the cost imposed by the threat. Consider what Russia must now defend simultaneously. It has warships at Novorossiysk, naval facilities in Crimea, oil terminals, grain terminals, ferries, bridges, coastal radars, fuel tankers supplying occupied territory, export tankers carrying revenue-generating cargo, and commercial vessels moving through the Sea of Azov. Each target has a different owner, function, vulnerability, and political value. Ukraine does not need to attack all of them at once. It needs to create enough uncertainty that Russia must prepare as if it might. That uncertainty is expensive. The economics of shipping are built around risk calculation. Insurers, owners, charterers, lenders, ports, and crews price the probability that a voyage will be completed safely. War risk premiums rise when attacks become frequent or unpredictable. Some reputable service providers withdraw. Less transparent operators may take their place, often at higher cost and with weaker safety standards. Older vessels remain in service longer because better ships and established companies avoid the route. This can create a dangerous cycle. The vessels most willing to enter a high-risk trade may also be the vessels least capable of surviving an accident. Older tankers with uncertain maintenance and questionable insurance carry enormous quantities of oil through crowded waters. Adding improvised structures may reduce one threat while introducing new operational complications. The environmental risk is not secondary. A tanker does not have to sink to release fuel or cargo. A collision during evasive movement, an onboard fire, or damage near a sensitive coastline can create consequences far beyond the military objective. Cleanup and compensation become even more difficult when ownership and insurance are opaque. For Ukraine, this means target selection and political communication are as important as technical capability. A strike that clearly interrupts military logistics may gain support. An operation that causes major civilian or environmental harm could damage Ukraine's diplomatic position. The most effective campaign is not the one that produces the largest explosion. It is the one that imposes sustained pressure without uniting neutral states against it. For Russia, the same dilemma appears in reverse. Moscow benefits from describing all attacks on shipping as piracy or terrorism. But when tankers are integrated into fuel delivery for occupied Crimea or sanctions evasion, their commercial identity becomes harder to separate from the war economy. Russia wants the protection of civilian status and the utility of military logistics at the same time. Ukraine is challenging that ambiguity. The result is a maritime gray zone where merchant ships receive battlefield defenses, commercial ports receive military protection, and naval drones perform missions once assigned to submarines, missiles, or fast attack craft. This may be one of the most important naval developments of the war. Ukraine began the full-scale invasion with a small, conventional navy compared with Russia. It could not compete ship for ship. It did not need to. By combining shore-based missiles, intelligence, aerial drones, sea drones, and repeated attacks on bases, it reduced the operational freedom of the Black Sea Fleet. Russia moved many major vessels away from Sevastopol. The fleet remained dangerous, but its ability to operate close to Ukraine became constrained. The next phase expands the target from the Navy to the maritime system supporting the war. Warships are only one part of sea power. Ports, tankers, repair facilities, ferries, pilots, tugs, storage tanks, shipping schedules, insurance, and access to safe routes are also part of it. A navy protects commerce, and commerce supports military power. When merchant vessels require steel cages and armed protection, the boundary between those systems begins to disappear. That is why the Caruzo matters. It is only one old tanker. Its modifications do not prove the shadow fleet is collapsing. Russia can continue exporting oil. It can replace damaged vessels, change routes, use different ports, and accept higher costs. A netted tanker can still carry a valuable cargo. Novorossiysk can reopen after an alert. The Sea of Azov can resume traffic after disruption. No single image should be mistaken for strategic defeat. But the image is still powerful because it captures a reversal. Russia once used its larger fleet, longer coastline, and control of Crimea to threaten Ukrainian shipping. Ukraine's ports operated under missile attack. Russian warships carried Caliber cruise missiles. Moscow tried to control access to the northwestern Black Sea and use maritime pressure against Ukraine's economy. Now, Russian tankers pass through international waterways wearing improvised armor against Ukrainian drones. The country with the larger navy is modifying merchant ships because the country with the smaller navy created a threat it cannot ignore. That is asymmetric warfare in its clearest form. Ukraine does not have to patrol every shipping lane with frigates or submarines. The possibility of attack can travel farther than the weapon itself. Once captains and operators believe a route is exposed, they begin changing schedules and demanding protection before another drone is even launched. The attacker uses relatively affordable, adaptable systems to create a protection problem across a vast network of expensive assets. The defender may intercept many drones and preserve most ships. Yet it still has to pay for protection, delay operations, change behavior, and live with the possibility that one weapon will reach a critical point. The strategic question is therefore not, can a steel net stop a drone? Some of them probably can. Some will not. The better question is, how many ships, ports, and routes must Russia protect, and how long can it sustain the cost? Ukraine is trying to make that number as large as possible. Every new defensive cage is evidence that the threat has been accepted. Every altered route shows that planning has changed. Every suspended loading window shows that an attack can reach beyond the immediate target. Every additional patrol, inspection, escort, and insurance premium turns a cheap drone into a continuing expense for the Russian system. This is how a maritime campaign accumulates power. Not through one decisive fleet battle, but through hundreds of decisions made by captains, port managers, security officers, ship owners, insurers, and military commanders. Sail now or wait. Enter port or remain offshore. Concentrate protection or spread it thin. Carry the cargo or decide the voyage is no longer worth the risk. Russia will continue searching for answers. The barriers will improve. Ships will receive cameras and electronic systems. Ports will add more layers of defense. Patrols will become more organized. Ukraine will adjust in response. The Black Sea will become a laboratory for the future of unmanned naval warfare. Other navies are watching carefully. They are studying how low-cost systems threaten expensive warships and unarmed commercial vessels. They are watching how ports defend narrow approaches, how merchant crews operate during drone alerts, how electronic warfare performs over water, and how legal responsibility changes when civilian shipping becomes part of a war economy. The lesson will travel far beyond Ukraine and Russia. Future conflicts may begin with commercial vessels receiving improvised defenses before traditional fleets ever exchange fire. Ports may become fortified drone bases and drone targets at the same time. Tankers and container ships may require escorts in waters once considered safe. The line between naval warfare and economic warfare will become increasingly difficult to see. For now, that future is already visible in the Bosphorus. An aging tanker passes between Europe and Asia. It carries the signs of sanctions, secrecy, and war. Its owners may be hidden behind layers of companies. Its flag may tell only part of its story. But the nets and cages are impossible to hide. They tell us that Ukraine's drones have changed the calculation. The Shadow Fleet once depended on remaining unseen. Now it has become visible for the strangest possible reason. Russia has wrapped it in steel. The defenses may save individual ships. They may reduce damage. They may force Ukraine to spend more weapons or search for different targets. But they also reveal the scale of the problem Moscow is trying to solve. Russia is no longer protecting only its Black Sea fleet. It is trying to protect the commercial bloodstream behind the war. And Ukraine has turned every tanker, port, loading schedule, and narrow sea lane into part of the battlefield. Stay with us. There is more to come.